It's a pleasure to be here. It's great. This is my first visit to Strelka. It's my first visit to Moscow. It's been a blast so far. It can only get better tonight with you. And I work for the Swedish games industry. And I will start by talking about games in general and Swedish games in general in specific. And then I will hand over to Kristoffer, who will talk about particular cases that he has been working on and the decisions and the creative process involved in them. So we have a great show for you. Let's see. Can I get my slides, please? All right. Maybe I have to do something here. No? This is the still before the storm. The moment before everything breaks, before chaos comes. So what games have you guys been playing lately? Minecraft, Battlefield, great, two Swedish games. Witcher, that's Polish. Mirror's Edge, that's great. He's here, the man himself. And I heard EVE Online, that's Icelandic actually. Yeah, great game though, great game. More. World of Warcraft. Yes, that's American. Come again? Overwatch, yes. The sister to World of Warcraft. More. What's that? Light Drifter? What's that? I don't know that game. Populous 2? Oh, Team Fortress 2. I thought you said Populous. It would have been very surprising if somebody had played Populous your age, young man. Who's played Populous? Yeah, so you're old. That's a British game, by the way. Are we good to go? There we go. All right, great. So thanks for that. Thanks for sharing your game habits with me. I heard some Swedish games in there, so extra points for that. Okay, here we go. My name is Per Strömberg. I work as a spokesperson for the Swedish games industry. We're a business association. The members are companies that make games. I have also been a game developer, but all those sins are so far in the past, so nobody cares about them. Except you can see one of the sins right here. This beautiful artwork is my contribution to the game's culture history. Rock Manager. It was released in 2001, translated to 14 languages, and failed 14 times. So that's why I now work for the Business Association. And I've been in this industry forever, by the way. This is my boss. His name is Kristoffer Sundberg. He's the creative director and co-founder of Avalanche Studios. You may know some of their games like Mad Max and Just Cause. Have you played some of those games? The Hunter, yeah. Do you know where this picture is from? Do you know this place? This is Times Square in New York City. This is the NASDAQ billboard at Times Square. I like to show this picture to show that Swedish games have reached the peak of capitalism. There is no higher glory in capitalism than to be on display in Times Square. I will talk a little bit about money, but I like to also talk about the art of video games. So now you know who I'm working for. Here are some Swedish games. Can you see them in the back? Okay. You see Minecraft, that's great. And some of the games actually that my friend Kristoffer has worked on, we'll talk about Mirror's Edge.
Yeah, that's right. I will go deeper into Mirror's Edge when it's my turn on stage. And I came from Massive Entertainment, so I've been involved in the division before. And right now I am playing around a little bit with Battlefield 1, but I can't talk about that tonight, unfortunately.
We can ask you, and we can try to get some information from you.
You can ask.
And your company also made a little game called Star Wars Battlefront.
That is true. That is true. Another nice thing. I wasn't involved in that one, though.
Yeah. And the division was with your previous employer, Massive Entertainment from Malmö, Sweden.
That's right. I was involved in the very beginnings of that game, and then I moved on to DICE, and so I wasn't involved in the full production. But I did take a little bit a small part in the introduction of that game.
I'm sure it's your contribution that made it the quickest selling new franchise of all time in the history of Ubisoft Entertainment.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, one of the points I like to make is that Swedes are so humble, and that's part of our success. This will not be a demonstration of humble tonight. So, as you can see, there are many kinds of games, many different games that come out of the Swedish games industry, and this is part of the success. So I will try to tonight with you trace the reason how can a small country of less than 10 million people in a faraway corner of the world make games that every 10th person on the planet plays. It's a mystery. How can that be? It's like the the bumblebee that can't fly. It just defies logic. Why Sweden? How come all these games come from Sweden? I don't have the answer, but I have some clues that I will share with you. All right, so I'll leave that there, and then we'll talk about figures and statistics and charts for a while. This is the only slide with numbers on it, so bear with me. But this is from our annual report. It's called the Game Developer Index, and it looks like this. I brought a bunch of copies. If you can find them, they're by the exit if you want to dig deeper into these numbers. You can also find it on our website, swedishgamesindustry.com, if you're interested. But this is the economic development of the Swedish games industry in the last 5 years. So as you can see, the turnover has increased 8 times in 4 years. And that's because of games like Battlefield, but also because of games like Minecraft and Candy Crush. Who's played Candy Crush? You can say, we're among friends here, you don't have to be shy. I'm level 186. I played a lot of Candy Crush. All right. So Candy Crush and Minecraft are a big part of this development. And also, this is the second point here is employment. So if you ask why the Swedish embassy invites us to something like this, it's because we create so many jobs for Sweden and create so much tax revenue. So thank you, Swedish embassy, for giving back for all the hard work we did. So the number of jobs has tripled in 4 years. And the last one, the yellow one, I'm sorry, if you don't speak Swedish, this is number of women. The games industry used to be a habitat for young men with really bad social skills. But that's changing now. More and more women are considering games as a career. And we've seen a tremendous growth. There's 5 times as many women working for the Swedish games industry today as 4 years ago. All right. I'm happy to take detailed questions about the numbers, but we'll save that for the end because I'm not sure everybody's interested in that. Okay, so what does this mean then in practice? That's Notch, yeah, great guy. Very, very talented, very gifted game developer. And he sold his company. He sold his company Mojang to Microsoft almost 2 years ago. And this was the headline in the Swedish media. And the price point for Mojang was. Do you know how much Microsoft paid? I mean, it says there on the slide, but they paid $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion to get Minecraft. And you know, what does $2.5 billion mean besides a lot of money or a lot of money? Well, we can compare that to another successful company, Volvo Cars, which is, I like to think of the crown jewel of Swedish industrialism. That was also acquired by an overseas company, the Chinese car maker Geely. And does anyone know what Geely paid for Volvo Cars? $1.8 billion. $1.8 billion. So that's why I like to say blocks over cars. I mean, Volvo makes great cars. I used to own a Volvo. So, you know, don't buy Minecraft instead of a Volvo. You can have both. That's fine. And actually, Minecraft was founded in 2011, which is the year after Geely bought Volvo cars. Okay, and there's another more recent example where Activision bought Candy Crush maker King for even more money, $5.9 billion US dollars. So it's more than twice what Microsoft paid for Mojang. So we see these big foreign companies making big investments and buying companies in Sweden. It's not only buying companies, it's also opening studios. So Rovio, you know, the Finnish game maker that made Angry Birds. Who played Angry Birds? Again, you're among friends here, yeah? I think the game was better than the movie, but you know, that's for anyone to decide. But they opened a studio in Stockholm because they wanted to be part of this. So they didn't buy a company, instead they started their own. And actually Swedish companies are also buying companies overseas. For example, Paradox Entertainment bought the vampire game maker White Wolf last autumn. So it's a two-way street, this investment. All right. So that's the money part. Now, I promised to say something about virtual reality. Who's tried virtual reality? Okay, good. Because you're the new hip people who try the new stuff first. This is my kid, he's 7, and he's also tried VR. He's never been the same since. So VR is this mystery, right? There's this beautiful technology. It's a mind-blowing experience. And so many big companies, both electronics manufacturers from Korea and Silicon Valley companies, and even Swedish companies have made huge bets that VR is going to be the next big thing. And a lot of people say, well, there's no demand. There's no audience for VR yet. But actually there's one Swedish game called Bait, that just announced they had 700,000 downloads on this, and it's a fishing game, a VR fishing game, not necessarily the first game concept you would have imagined. So there may be an audience, at least 700,000. But Tommy Palm, who made the game Bait with his team, he once said in an interview, I see VR breaking through in 5 years, and AR, you know, augmented reality, breaking through in 10 years. But actually it seems that AR is coming faster than we think, because what was the big hit in games this summer, if not... Do you know it? Pokemon Go, yeah, who played it? Hands up, that's great. So, would you agree that it's an augmented reality game? So it may be that augmented reality is doing something that VR is not doing at the moment. I don't know, we can have a conversation about that later, but now at least I have done as I promised and touched on the topic of virtual reality. If you want more, we can revisit that in the Q&A. Okay, now this game, does anyone know this game? It would be weird because you probably would have grown up in Sweden in the 90s if you played this game. But maybe this game is build cars with Mulle Meck. Mulle Meck was a children's book character that was made into a game, and the game is so the backstory is that Mulle has a dog, and his dog's name is Buffa, and Mulle wants to show Buffa what's at the end of the road. And for this purpose, he needs to build a car. So the game is, how can you build a car so that you can go to the end of the road? Does anybody really care about the end of the road? It's the building that's the fun part of this game, right? You can create something of your own. You can build a car that's unlike anybody else's car. The driving was useless. You didn't even get to drive the car. You could just control it with the arrow buttons on your keyboard, but if you crashed, you didn't see it. There was just like an announcement that said you had crashed. Oh, we crashed because we had no brakes. And then you had to go back and put brakes on the car. So it's a very simple game, and yet this game was awarded in 1998 Best Multimedia Title in Europe. It was the best that we could do 18 years ago. And our ambitions were sky high. The voice actors came from the Royal Dramatic Theatre in Stockholm. It was the best voice acting money could buy. And yet it was so simple. So what made this game such a runaway success? I like to think that it gave the player a toolbox to release the player's own creativity, which, by coincidence, is a concept that still stands today. Because what is Minecraft if not a toolbox to unlock the player's own creativity? Except it's so much more sophisticated, and you can actually interact and you can work together with other players online. So I think these two cases say something about the nature of games. It's the interactivity, it's the player's own creativity, it's the promise of being part of creating an experience that makes games different from all other forms of art and entertainment. Of course, there are many other genres than building games, but the interactivity is there, because if there's no interactivity, it's no game. All right, so I made that point. Now I'm going to move to the Swedish situation, what's special about Sweden. Have you heard about this event, DreamHack? Yes. So it's like the biggest party for nerds you could ever find. 14,000 people spend 3 days together. They don't really sleep. They don't really play that much, but they hang out with their screens, and it's such a beautiful. This is like the sky at night. The stars come out. It's a very beautiful place to visit, and it's so calm. Nobody's running. Nobody's screaming. Everybody's friendly, and they share this love for games and everything digital. And for us as an industry, it's great to have an active grassroots community like that, to have access to our players, to have players that come together and we can meet them, we can talk to them, we can ask them what they like about our games or not. And there's lots of individual creativity coming out of this place as well. Another aspect of that would be esports, which is one of the biggest trends at the moment in games. Does anyone know this team? NIP, that's right, Ninjas in Pyjamas. So they're world champions in several of the different, I think FIFA and Counter-Strike, they've been world champions in both of those. It's becoming a professional sport. This is a professional team. They have a professional business with the outside owners and sponsors, and they go to training camps in Korea and whatnot. So it's a separate industry inside the industry. Do you know this guy? Yeah, that's right. Do you like PewDiePie? So, what's that? Robles, yeah. Or maybe CutiePie, his girlfriend, yeah. But PewDiePie, he made his fame. A lot of people think that he made his fame playing Minecraft, but actually the first game that made him famous was Amnesia by Frictional Games, which is a small studio in Helsingborg in Sweden. So it's fair to say that Swedish games in a way made PewDiePie, and also PewDiePie has been a great promoter, a great poster boy for Swedish games. So we have this situation where there's a lot of activity going on around the game developers and the businesses. There's an active culture in many different ways. And now I'd like to trace the roots of the success of the Swedish game developers as promised. So first out, if you want to have a successful games industry anywhere in the world, there are some basic requirements. Without these, you will not have a games industry at all. They're not enough to compete with the global competition. This is just the basics. From the top, you need a really old computer. No, you need computer skills, and you need access to computer hardware, and you need an active computer science community. You need active people programming. There needs to be enough, like a critical mass of people who know computers. So that's the first point. And the second point is, so this is supposed to say broadband internet. If you don't have broadband internet, there's no way you can do digital distribution. There's no way you can do online forums. There's no way you can interact with your players. I mean, that's how Minecraft got big. Notch invited the players to take part really early. That could not have happened without good internet, broadband. This is international airports. We're a global business. And if you don't have international airports, there's no way that your business contacts can come and visit you. So you need to be close to an international airport. This hat, I don't know if you have hats like this. This is a Swedish student hat. You get this on graduation. So you need good education. So you need to have a good education system to provide the industry with skilled talent. Without that, there's no way you can find the right people to hire. And this one is a little bit dodgy. This is freedom of speech and freedom of enterprise. If we don't have freedom of enterprise, we can't start companies. If we don't have freedom of speech, we can't make the games we want. So that's also necessary. And this is He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. I'm not saying you need He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, but you need access to the global trash culture, because what are games if not a part of global trash culture? So you need all of these things to have a successful games industry, but none of them are enough. You also need something extra, and this is what I think Sweden has. So let me take you through this. Sweden has a really small home market. We're a small country in a faraway corner of the world. We don't have enough people to buy and play our games. So that's why we found out early that we had to go global and make games for the global audience. So that was a key moment when we managed to take a disadvantage and turn it into one of our strong points. And also, if you have a small home market, you can do soft launches and make all the mistakes with your Swedish players, and then you can make the game better before you make a global launch. So that's the first success factor for Sweden. We have such a small home market. I think you may be familiar with this. If you have really crappy weather, it's great, because that means you stay inside and work harder on your game. There's not so much distraction. I mean, what are you doing here? You should be working on your games. Go home, work harder. This is... No, it's fine. It's a beautiful summer night. We also like to stay out in the few months. But it's a blessing to have long, dark winters. I think the people in Southern Europe, for example, they're distracted by gelato and street corner cafes and whatever. Sweden also has a strong social security system, which means that you can try and fail without having to leave your home or your family. It means that if you're young, you can just be stupid and do nothing for a few years before you realize you have to sign up for a game design course at university and join the games industry. So it's a very important part of the labor market in Sweden. And speaking of the labor market, we have job security, which means that we can tell our boss to bugger off because he cannot fire you easily. That gives the employee a strong position, and that's really good if you work in a creative job, because creativity needs to be a little bit all over the place. I know other games companies in other countries that are very hierarchical, and that works for some types of games, but the games, or for the Swedish games industry, it's great to have this labor market, because we don't overstress the individual when we talk about creativity and making games. Instead, we emphasize the team. It's not one person that makes a great game, it's a team that makes a great game. And if you have a great team, that's the most precious thing you can have as a games company, because that team can that team can move mountains. Without that, you may have a brand, you may have the technology, but if you don't have the team, you cannot make any good games. So it's the team that's the creative unit. And that's also a typical Swedish flavor. We have a very collective mindset. Some people talk about the consensus culture in Sweden. And they like to say that's a bad thing, but actually for us it's a good thing, because that means that we have a good climate, a good mindset for working together. Oh, maybe I should explain what's in the picture. Do you know this picture? Do you know this? Soccer, yeah. This is the Swedish women team in the Olympics in Brazil just the other week. And they played really well. You know what they did? They won the silver medal. Yes, that's another story where Sweden, what is Sweden? We're not a soccer nation. We don't have the best players. We can't even play half the year. There's no stars that come to Sweden to play. But we don't have the best players, but we have the best team, or the second best team, because it was a silver, not a gold. But they played as a team, they played as a unit, and that's just like making games. Very unlike, I don't know if you follow soccer, but very unlike the Swedish men's team that competed in the Euros, because they didn't play as a team, they played as a team with a one-star player, Zlatan Ibrahimovic, and he was supposed to do everything. And how many goals did they score? 0. The only goal that Sweden men team scored in the Euros was an own goal by the other team. So in that way, making games is very much like football. In other ways, maybe not so much. But the collective mindset is a very strong opportunity. It's a strength of the Swedish culture that comes out very well in games. And that also means that it's easy for us to integrate new people with other backgrounds from other countries, other parts of the world to our team. Many of our companies have 30 or 40 nationalities working for them. And that's, of course, also a great asset to have so many different kinds of people with different understandings and perspectives. That adds to the creativity. Okay, so I guess I made that point. I can't make that point any stronger. Another very typical Swedish thing is Luther. I don't know what your relationship to Luther is, but we're not very religious, but Luther is very strong in Sweden. Luther tells us we should work harder, and if we work really hard, there's a reward at the end. And that's very similar to making a game. You crunch for months and months, and then you release it, and you can go on your break, which is normally in the middle of the winter anyways. But so we have a lot to thank Luther for. And another very typical Swedish culture or Scandinavian culture is the Jante law. Are you familiar with the Jante law? It's not a law that the police will enforce. It's an attitude. But the Jante law says, don't think you're better than anyone. Actually, everyone else is better than you, so you better try harder. And that's really good if you want to make a game, because it's so much about attention to detail, crushing bugs, doing game balance really nicely. So that's another culture thing that we grew up with, the focus on negativity and the poor self-esteem. Very helpful if you want to make games. But all these things said, there are two pop culture phenomena of the 80s that have played the most important part in the Swedish games boom. And it's these two. So the Commodore 64 was hugely popular in the 80s, and it brought a generation of self-taught programmers. Drakar och Demoner, that was a Swedish pen and paper role-playing game. It wasn't Dungeons and Dragons, it just sounded like Dungeons and Dragons, but very similar. So have you played these pen and paper role-playing games? You can be the bard or the thief or the knight or the magician, and then you have to go into a fantasy world and kill a dragon or find a treasure or something like that. So it's a great practice for imagination. So this game was hugely popular in the 80s in Sweden, and it trained a generation of game designers, because every session is really an exercise in game design. And I haven't met anyone, or maybe someone, but almost anyone that has a game company in Sweden that has not grown up, that didn't grow up playing Drakar och Demoner and coding on the Commodore 64. Everyone who's founded a successful games company did these two things in the 80s. And that's the stuff that our parents said we were wasting our time doing. What are you doing playing on the Commodore 64 all the time? And we created 3,000 jobs. Kristoffer, is this familiar to you? Did you grow up with these things?
This is very familiar. I got both when I was 7 years old, so yeah, definitely. I mainly played on the Commodore 64. I didn't code that much, but I did play a lot of pen and paper RPGs, and I still do sometimes, so definitely.
All right, so don't take my word for it. There's evidence right there. Oh, Sinclair, yeah, the ZX Sinclair, the Amiga, there were some early Ataris, absolutely. Let's say the Commodore 64 and the VIC-20, of course. This is the symbol of all those early computers that were finally available in the homes. All right, so that's my analysis of the success factors of the Swedish industry. I'd like to make a few more points before I invite Kristoffer to take the stage. First of all, this homepage is from an initiative called Diversi. It's something we're involved in to have greater diversity and equality in the industry. As you saw, we still only have 18% women, so we need to be better because we're missing out on a lot of talent. So Diversi is an initiative with the games industry, the games educations, and the gamers themselves as a grassroots movement to find different ways to promote more opportunity for different people in the industry. And we've done a lot of things, but one of the things we did was we invited 10 female students from all over Europe who were so we took them to the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco this spring as a way to kickstart their career, as a way to give them a boost and an advantage to compensate for the disadvantage of being in a minority. So you can check it out at diversi.nu if you want to learn more. That's one of the initiatives we've taken. There's also a dark side to the games industry with hate speech online and harassment and threats. And when the Gamergate controversy broke 3 years ago now, the Swedish studio heads were, to my knowledge, the only management, the only leaders in the industry that took a public stand and said, not in our name. Don't say you know better who can decide who should play our games. Our games are for everyone who wants to play them. So that's something that we're still struggling with. But I like to think that as the industry grows and has more and more to choose from, we invite more kinds of people to play, and hate speech will pass in time. Because what's going on now is that games used to be for this guy. And we could make games for people who were just like ourselves. But now, in the past 10 years, games have become for everyone. So, yeah, this is everyone, at least in my slide. And that's a real challenge for us, because we have to learn how to make games for somebody who are different than us. We have to try to get into the head of a person who has a completely different frame of reference. So this is one of the things that I think we struggle with as an industry, and something that we have to understand and work with. But we like to, I mean, in a way, this is also a false picture, because the saying that games used to be for a very small number of people, and now it's for a very large number of people. But that's not really true, because if you look at the history of games, games are part of civilization. Games have always been something that humans have done. Chess, Go, Mahjong, those games date back hundreds and thousands of years. I don't know if you had this, but when I grew up, we had a game in preschool called Kalaha. And do you see the pyramids and the Sphinx? I'm sure they just put it on the box to sell more. But these types of games with balls in pits, Archaeologists have found traces of them in Africa hundreds of years before Christ. They're called the Mancala family of games. So that proves that games is not a new phenomenon. It's something that we've always done. It's part of playing, is part of being human. It's what we are. Homo ludens, the playing man. So when we look back on this era of the past few decades, when we thought that games were for very few young men living in the basements, not getting enough sunlight, we will see that as just an exception in the large scope of things. And now we're getting back to normal, which is that everybody plays. That's my last point. Now you can clap. Thank you. Thanks for the attention and the interaction. And now I'd like to invite my friend Kristoffer Emgård to give his presentation. He's the narrative writer at DICE. You heard before, he's made games. He's worked on games like The Division. Who's played The Division? Yeah, there you go. And of course the new Mirror's Edge Catalyst. Who played Mirror's Edge Catalyst? Yes, there you go. And here he is. And also, Kristoffer, you are the only non-American to ever have been nominated for the Writers Guild Award for Best Interactive Writing. So if that's not enough, I don't know what is. Take it away.
Thank you very much. All right, so while Per talked to you a lot about the sort of game industry in Sweden and games in a more general sense, I'm going to dive into what it was like working on Mirror's Edge from a narrative standpoint. But first, just to understand like who I am and where I sort of come from, a little bit about my background. This is me when I was 16 years old. I'm a troll. And I was doing a lot of live action role-playing at the time, and also pen and paper RPGs like Per mentioned before. Of course, I played tons and tons of video games. And as I grew older, I also started reviewing games a little bit, which gave me some analytical skills that I could use when I eventually ended up in the industry. I started out with a company called Massive Entertainment that are now part of Ubisoft. And the first game I worked on was World in Conflict, which incidentally is about a third world war between Soviet Union and the America, which I'm happy to say that none of them wins, but still. I stayed with Massive for 7 years, and then just as the division was ramping up for real, I was offered to go to Stockholm and work on Mirror's Edge, which was my latest release. And so as a narrative director, there are a lot of different responsibilities involved. Of course, the main part is creating and writing the storyline, but that's not all, because as a director, the responsibility is to make sure that the narrative comes across in the game to the player through all the different channels used. And so I also take part in the casting and the recording of cinematics and so on. This is me being a dead person. I think I'm some sort of extra while recording motion capture. And also, of course, doing a lot of research. This is me in Moscow 9 years ago, visiting the Armed Forces Museum, doing research for World in Conflict. I saw a few hands raised for having played Mirror's Edge, and that's great. But for the rest of you, I want to show you a trailer from the game and then talk briefly about what the game is about, so that when I go into developing it, you will understand a little bit what I'm talking about. And this is the trailer.
I once knew a young woman who would defy anyone and anything in order to do what she felt was right. But you're clearly not her. You're broken.
Anything having to do with Gabriel Kruger, we need to stay miles away from.
Look, I thought that this would be a
No, you didn't think, Faith. You never do.
Don't get lost.
Barely out of prison and already stirring things up? Your parents would be proud.
Mr. Kruger, he is out for runner blood. Whatever it is you stole from him must be very valuable.
Stop her! If you keep keep this up, I swear you'll be dead in a month.
Using every weapon at our disposal, we've got to destroy it.
Back off.
Kruger did this, and he'll be able to do it to anyone unless he's stopped.
Get out of my sight.
That's it?
What else is there?
You're wrong. I'm not broken.
Prove it.
So, there's a fighter in you after all.
And that's Faith. So, Mirror's Edge Catalyst. Thank you. Mirror's Edge Catalyst is centered around this person, Faith Connors. She's the main character, and the story revolves around her actions and her choices. She is a runner in a sort of futuristic world where the runners work as cat burglars and couriers, and they help out or work for the large corporations that rule this world. The runners are also sort of living outside of the law, so they are hunted, and they try to sort of live their own lives outside of the control of the rest of society. The mega corporations that rule this world, there is no real government, it's just corporate control. They have a lot of surveillance, and everybody knows what everybody's doing all the time, and the runners try to stay outside of this. And Faith, she's sort of reckless and eager to prove herself in the runner community, and her actions eventually gets her involved in a larger conspiracy that she uncovers, and also has her questioning some of her own past and the history of who she is and so on. And along the way, she'll be doing quite a bit of fighting, and also, of course, running, which is what the game is primarily about. So, developing a game like this and developing a narrative for it is done through what is mainly called an iterative process. And I will talk a little bit about this and how we sort of came about what became Mirror's Edge. And first of all, what you should know is that 2007 was when the original Mirror's Edge came out. So Mirror's Edge Catalyst is a reboot of this game. And we started out knowing that, okay, we want to make this game again, but we want to improve some things and retain others, the things that were the strengths of the first game. And so the main thing, of course, was to develop Faith further. We wanted to keep her as a main character. We felt she was really powerful. And to dive more into who she is and her history. And also, we wanted to improve the level of storytelling in the game by having real cutscenes and more advanced voiceovers and so on. And performance capture is when you put actors in a room full of cameras, and they get to wear these spandex suits with small balls on them that record all their movements. And they also wear weird helmets with cameras mounted on the end that film their faces so that when they speak lines and so on, we get data that we can use for the animations to make it look more real. We also wanted to make sure that Faith had a larger city to explore and that she would be able to go from point to point in her own way, or the player would be allowed to choose their own path to a larger extent. The first game was very linear. You would go from A to B and there was only really one way to go. And we wanted to expand upon that and make a larger world where the player could choose for themselves how to move and how to get from place to place. We also wanted to improve the combat system of the first game. The first game was a little bit conflicted. Faith was encouraged not to use guns, and still she was forced to use guns now and then, so we removed guns completely from the second one and tried to focus more on creating a more fun and involving close combat system. And we also, of course, wanted to strengthen the themes of the first game from a narrative standpoint. Like I was talking about surveillance and control and large corporations and so on. And all of that was present in the first game, but not as pronounced. And we wanted to sort of push that further and sort of delve deeper into that. And of course, to evolve the city that Faith runs in. The city itself is a character almost. And especially when allowing for free roaming and allowing the player to move in their own and choose their own paths. And so when developing the narrative and the storytelling for this type of thing, since the game is story-driven, but it's not it didn't start with a story. It starts with gameplay. And when I approach this, I need to sort of reverse engineer what I need to do for the storyline. So I need to ask, like, what does gameplay need? What does level design need? And what does art need from a story standpoint? In this particular case, it was a story that supports running and supports a lot of movement throughout the city. And that supports movement puzzles. When Faith is given different missions, part of the gameplay is figuring out how to get where you need to go. And the story, of course, then also needs to support that to really work. And also to create a narrative that would support the very distinct art style. Like, why does this city look the way it does? Why does the characters look the way they do, and so on? I had to sort of find ways to explain that. There are ways, sometimes like when you make a movie, you start with a script, and then everything else grows from the script. But here the script sort of grows from the needs of all these other departments. And that can be different. Some games start with a script as well, so this is not necessarily how everybody does it, but this is how we did it on Mirror's Edge. And when I've sort of answered those questions and I figured out, like, what does all these departments need, I set about creating the lore of the world. Building, like, what is this world about? What are these corporations about? How many corporations are there? What are the characters are there in this world that Fate needs to interact with, and so on. And I create a lot of lore, and some of it never makes it into the game, but it's really useful for me and for the other game designers, or level designers and art people, because it helps them also create and expand upon the world and make it bigger and feel larger than what you maybe actually see. And then once the lore is sort of in place and we're happy with that world, I go into writing the actual sort of high-level script, the high-level storyline for the game, which at this point usually is about plotting out the major events that are supposed to happen as you play through the game. I don't want to go into too much detail while doing this, because it might be that we change design along the way, and then I need to be able to be flexible with the story. And also a big part of building the narrative for this type of game is deciding how will the story be told to the player. For Mirror's Edge, we decided to go with stuff that's been proven. We didn't really do anything new in terms of narrative, because we felt that the gameplay itself, which is about parkour, free running, jumping, climbing in first person, which is very unusual, that itself was so new that we felt using proven tools for storytelling was the way to go. And the narrative tools chosen for Mirror's Edge was, of course, the cinematics I mentioned before. And these would contain the main sort of plot events and main character interactions. The major turning points and so on are most of them told through cinematics. And then the bread and butter of most games, which is what we call voiceover or in-air voiceover or radio messages, which is while you are playing, and this is in many, many first-person shooter games, you get radio messages from somebody telling you what to do, telling you what is happening around the world, sometimes several characters interacting with one another, and so on. And so part of the drama, part of the narrative is played out through that tool. Also, for those players that like story, that want more of it, we want to provide ways of expanding the world even further. And so we have what we call lore pickups. In Mirror's Edge, we call them surveillance tapes. You can pick them up, and you can listen to these recordings from different people in the city. And if you pick up all of them and you collect them, you can get small stories that all of them somehow connect to this world and to Faith herself. But they're not necessary to finish the game, I should add. And then we also, for this game, since it takes place in a huge city, we wanted the city to feel a little bit alive. And so we felt that something that is common in this world is a lot of propaganda and newscasts that tell stories about the larger world outside the city, and also that comment on stuff that Faith does as she progresses through the game. And so we had these huge billboards put up all over the city where we would show these newscasts, and a lot of commercials for the different corporations that Faith works for. And then another thing which is very popular, is sort of a buzzword these days, called environmental storytelling. This is a very simple example because it's graffiti, and graffiti can tell a story, absolutely. But environmental storytelling is also about maybe showing that behind a beautiful facade of a city, there are dirty places, and there are places that are not very well kept. And this goes to show what this world is really like. And you've never said a word, and you've never written a word, but you show it instead. And that's sort of environmental storytelling in games. And so with the tools in place and the high-level narrative done, this is sort of the process of how I work with the level designers and sort of the game designers to develop the game proper. And it starts with the story premise, as I was saying, the high-level storyline where I provide the main plot points and the main turning points. The level designers then take this and make a first draft. Let's say I suggest that the game should have maybe 12 missions. And then each of the level designers responsible for each mission, they take that draft and they try to work it into an actual gameplay sequence. Like, what would you do as a player when running around in this world? And where in this experience, in each mission, would the main plot points happen, the main turning points? And then they discuss this with me, and sometimes they come with great ideas that I've never thought of, like, wouldn't it be great if this happened or that happened? And I try to revise my story to incorporate as much of that as possible. And this goes back to Per's point before about the collaborativeness of game making. At least the way we worked on Mirror's Edge, and actually in every team I've worked with, this has been key. There needs to be a direction, there needs to be an idea to start with, but once the process starts, there's a lot of back and forth between the different parts of a team, like art and me and level design and so on, and level design and art for that matter. And so I revise and maybe redesign the story a little bit based on their level design concept. The next step for them is to then actually build a level in a very simplified way, like placing out the basic building blocks. Almost like you would, create it with some sort of almost fake Legos in a way. Keep it very simple so that we can easily change things, because at this point it's still cheap to change things. And so they will build a level, we will try it out, we will test it quite a bit and run a lot back and forth to make sure that it's fun to play. And then once we feel that we got something that sort of works, the next step is to look at, can we actually do this in terms of, can we put real art on it? Can we make all the buildings needed for this? Can we make all the characters needed to populate the level and so on? Usually we can't. Usually the first idea that comes up, or the first white box level and the first design idea is very big, it's very large, contains a lot of details, a lot of wonderful stuff. But the hard reality of game making is that we seldom are able to do everything we want to do when we start out. So the cold hard world meets our glorious ambitions, and we cut down a little bit, and we find something that we feel this we can do. Once that is done, I go and I start write the script for what is actually happening in the level, like what radio messages will Faith get as she runs, what cutscenes will we show, where will we place those cutscenes in the level, and so on. And we also go ahead and make very simplified cutscenes, similar to how the level designer makes white boxed levels. And these help us decide on if the scene works or not, and also like how should it play in the level, and do we need to change things within the scene itself to make it better. And usually when we do these, we don't use real actors, we use ourselves. So it's designers and animators and whatnot playing these things out. I wish I had a video. Some of them can be quite hilarious in how worthless they are, but still. And then once this whole cycle is done, we do what I call rinse repeat. We do it all over again, because again we might find at this point that, oh, we need to change this, we need to fix that. Or testing shows that, players like 75% of the level, but they don't like the last quarter, so we need to fix that somehow. And we go through the whole thing again. We suggest new ideas, we revise, redesign, and so on. And then once we feel that we got something solid, and this is when the game is getting close to done, we start putting in what we call the final assets, like the full cutscenes. These have been recorded with the real actors. They cost a lot of money to make, so by this time we really need to make sure that we are making the stuff that we want to do and that we know needs to be in the game. And then also, for the very final pass, it's a lot about, I can sit down and play through the level and listen to like the messages being played in my ear as I play, and move around the timing a little bit and make sure that we get that final extra level of polishing. It's not always that we have time to do that final pass, but in an ideal world, that's what we should do. And that more or less sums up the game-making process, at least from my point of view. There are some severe challenges to game making, and before I move on into my sort of second part of the presentation, I will talk a little bit about storytelling in general and game storytelling. These are some of the challenges and learnings that I've made throughout my 10 years of game making by now. The first of this is that it's very, very challenging to plan for innovation. I mean, we try hard. We spend millions and hundreds of millions of dollars on budgets for these things. And we try really hard to like, okay, we have maybe 2 or 3 years to do a game. How do we need to plan to finish it on time and so on? But a lot of the time we also want to do new things. And doing new things is really hard to know how long it will take to finish. And so we often find that, oh, this took way longer. Sometimes it took way shorter than expected, but often it took longer than expected. And even then we think, oh, we need to plan for it taking longer, but even then it takes even longer. So it's like a never-ending race. We can't really sort of ever come around this, in my experience. And what this leads to is that scope will be revised. When we start out with a game concept, as I was saying before, it can be a glorious thing. It has all these components, all these things that are going to happen. But along the way, as reality cuts in and as we nearing completion, we usually have to cut things from the game. And this is when the story especially can suffer if we're unlucky, because sometimes whole levels need to be cut. And it might be that that was a level where I, for example, had placed a very, very important turning point in the storyline. And if the level is removed, nobody will understand the story because it all goes to shit. So my learning from that is that as a storyteller, for games especially, I need to be very, very flexible for as long as possible throughout the game-making process. I need to be able to revise my story at a very late stage and still make sure that it's comprehensible to the player. And this can be hard sometimes, but there are different tricks, like making sure that a given cutscene is not bound to a specific location. Because if I can't get that location, maybe I can get another location, and then that cutscene can still be in the game, and so on. And finally, and this can't be said enough, testing, 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 and testing. Testing the game concept early on, testing as we go along, as we move through the development process, testing near the end. Testing is invaluable. I've seen game designers, level designers build levels that they love, and they play through them and they have so much fun, and then they give it to an external tester, somebody who have never seen the game before, and they don't understand at all what they're supposed to do. And it's a very, very sort of strong learning process to see somebody else play your game, somebody that has never played it before, and to understand that what you thought was obvious was completely obscure to them. And that in itself teaches you to be more, how to be more accessible and to be more sort of open with what you're doing. And that sort of concludes my first half. I'm moving into the sort of grand title of 21st century narrative, talking a little bit about storytelling in general and how it pertains to game narrative and game storytelling. And so my thinking is I'll walk you through the different main media forms of storytelling, pointing out a little bit what characterizes them, and then we're going to end on like what characterizes game storytelling, and you guys can compare for yourself a little bit on how these work together. So the novel, I'm sure you've all read one, or at least one, and also one of the oldest forms of storytelling ever. The novel is linear, with very few exceptions. Ironically, though, there were novels when I grew up that had you choose your own path, and many of them sort of became the inspiration for future video games. But the typical novel is linear. You read it from page 1 to page 500 or whatever. And a game, for example, is very non-linear, or can be very non-linear, and so in that way they differ quite a bit. Also, as a writer of a novel, you have extreme narrative freedom. You can do whatever you like, as long as you have the words to express it. You're not dependent on anybody else. You're not dependent on resources, on other people making your fantasy come true. You can put your fantasy on paper and relate it to the reader without anything in between. And that is an incredible freedom. Also, reading books is usually an individual experience. Every reader, if you give the same book to 10 different readers and then ask them to describe their experience, they would give you 10 very different descriptions, because everybody's own imagination fills in what the book prompts you to sort of imagine. And that makes it into a very, very individual thing to read. Also, writing books, I've written 2 way back. They're not very good. And they, working on that, it's an open structure. You're allowed to sort of, it can be as long as you like. It can be thousands of pages. It can be 10 pages. And also you can jump around in time, in space, in any way you like, as long as you maybe stay comprehensible to the reader. And that also, that open structure is also in itself a large freedom as a creator to have. Feature film, not very old, not as old as the novel, 120 years or so now. Also very linear in how it's told. There are, again, exceptions, but most films, you sit down and the events are given to you from beginning to end. They are, though, a combined media, which is, I think, very, very interesting, and also closer to what games are. When you watch a movie, it's not just the imagery. It's the music, it's the sound effects, it's the sometimes 3D. Back in the day, they tried smelling. Didn't work out very well, but still. So it sort of provides more of your senses, and that makes it very different from a book. Also, movies are more of a collective experience because it's so strong with imagery and music and so on. There's less for the viewer to interpret in terms of imaginative things. Of course, you would still get very different interpretations from a movie, but that could mainly be around things like character motivation or like why did the story end like that. But most people would agree that they saw a blue bird flying across the sky in any given scene, for example. So nobody would say that the bird was red unless they were colorblind. Movies and working with movies, I've done that too before I started in games, is a very rigid structure. When you write a movie script, you need to know that, okay, I have 120 pages I need to tell this story on. This is the standard. There are deviations from it, but it's the standard. And within those 120 pages, you need to be very strict on where you place your major plot points, your major turning points, and so on. And that can be actually a blessing. It can help you. It provides you with structure that you then just need to fill out. Then we have the television drama, which has grown very big in the last 15 years or so. They call it the third golden age of television. Also linear for the most part. Again, you start watching the first episode of something and it tells you a story until the 10th episode and an umptieth season, 7th season or whatever, if it's a long-running show. And since this does have many seasons and many episodes, it allows for long-form narrative. It allows for character development that takes place across hours and hours and hours. And we see now incredible stuff happening in television in terms of really delving into how a character goes from being one type of person to being a very different type of person. The recent success of Breaking Bad is a good example. A science teacher turns into a crack meth dealer, and he starts doing so to save his family, but ends, well, I shan't spoil, but he becomes a different person. Also, like movies, watching TV is a collective experience for the same reasons, I would say. It's still because the standardized sort of visuals and audio information that it's given to you. TV is different, though, in that it's an episodic structure. So you watch an hour, that hour needs to give you some sort of satisfaction in itself. It needs to have some sort of conclusion. You can leave with a cliffhanger for the next episode, but you still need to give some sort of ending within that hour. And that happens every hour. So if you have a TV series of 7 seasons, of let's say 10 episodes each, that's 70 episodes. They each need to have a proper ending to them. So that's 70 different endings. And that episodic structure is actually not very unlike video games. Mirror's Edge is told also in a way in episodes. There are a bunch of missions, and each of them is a little story in itself, and they all play a part in the larger story that is told throughout the game. Comics. I was very fortunate to write a comic in connection to Mirror's Edge Catalyst. It's a precursor to the game. It tells a story of what happened before the events that take place in the game. And so this was my first time writing a comic. It was a lot of fun. I hope to do it again. And I learned a lot of things along the way. Comics also is a very linear format. You need, I think, even more so than books, you need to really read it from page 1 until the last page to understand what the story is about. It can be both long form and short form. There are comics that are just over, just one strip, like 4 panels. There are comics that are thousands of pages long that tell a huge story, huge epic storyline over many, many, many comic books. Also, it's a semi-collective experience because I feel that comics also rely a lot on text. And so as soon as you involve text, you leave more to the imagination of the reader. Of course, at the same time, they are a visual medium, as we can see. So I would place it somewhere in between feature film and books in that regard. And they're for the most part episodic. The comic book sort of structure and industry is all based around the idea of the monthly comic book. 24 pages that tells you one storyline that ends with those 24 pages, but it can also be part of a larger story. But these days there are also these huge storytelling comics that are thousands of pages, and they're never published in book form as 24-page episodes, but they're sort of published more like real books, and so you read them in one go. And then video games. I've given a lot of speeches about video game narrative, and sometimes I get the question what are the video game genres? And I would say that there are more genres in video games than there are in any other media, because not only do we have video games that are like comedies or like action or thriller, like the typical movie genres, but we also have a myriad of formats that sort of decide what the story in that particular video game needs to be about. So we have the typical linear format, like Mirror's Edge to some extent, and also this example, Dead Space, that tells a story from beginning to end through a number of missions. But then we have games that doesn't necessarily rely on storytelling. These are multiplayer games where players create their own stories. Battlefield 1 and the Battlefield series are great examples of this, that you go online, you play for 20 minutes or several hours, and what you bring with you is your experience, your story, what you did in that particular moment when you were playing. And then we have these huge role-playing games that are sort of non-linear in many ways, because the player can go out and do side missions and do side stuff and never care about the main story of the game. There's a game called Skyrim. I don't know if you guys have played it. Any hands? A few? I've spent 170 hours in that game, and I still haven't finished the main storyline. I built a house. I married someone. I got kids. I did a lot of side missions. I think I almost won a war, but I still haven't finished the main storyline of the game. And that sort of is very non-linear in many respects. And then sports games, in a way similar to online multiplayer games like Battlefield. They don't necessarily have stories either, even though now it's actually happening that we are putting more stories into sports games as well, because as we've found, stories increase engagement. So almost in any type of video game you have, if you add just a little bit of story, the players care more about what you do and why you do it. And a great example is Mario, Super Mario Brothers. You jump throughout this world, but in the end it's about saving that princess. And I mean, it's very minor, it's very simple, but still it gives you a little bit of purpose to what you're doing. And I think purpose is a key thing for driving engagement when you play games. And so there are, of course, games that are purely about story. The Telltale games is a great example. Or I would say also games like The Witcher was mentioned before, which is a lot about telling the story and telling a great story. And in many of those games, sometimes like in a movie, the story came first. Another great example is The Last of Us, which is so story-driven that the idea behind the story was sort of the main driver behind the games. And then you have all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is Minecraft, for example, where there is no story, but it's all about gameplay and all about this sort of you doing what you want in this world. And that goes also between the linear experience and the sandbox experience. The extremely linear experience is where the game drives you forward. You don't really have any choice but to move forward within the game. And then all the way to sandbox, which is like Minecraft, like SimCity, where you get to choose exactly what to do all the time, and you create your own world. And games, it's a sort of closed structure because, like I was saying when working with Mirror's Edge, for example, I need to know the idea behind the game, need to be able to develop the story for it. And once I do, I know that I have this much time to tell the story. I have this many levels, this many characters. All this is decided by budget and ambition. And that makes it into much more closed structure than if I sit down and write a book. If I write a book, I can just continue writing for as long as I please until I'm done. Whereas in a game, I need to always take heed to what the other people are making within the game-making team. And yeah, we promised to say a little bit about virtual reality. I've tried out all the sets myself. And I would say this is a brave new world. I myself, I don't know the people here who have tried it, if you were as blown away as I was, but I was really blown away. To the point that I was flying a spaceship in one of the demos, and in the ship, my virtual pilot, my virtual self, is grabbing the flight stick with one hand and the accelerator with another hand, like this. But in reality, I was controlling the game with a controller like a typical PlayStation or Xbox controller. And my brain couldn't compute the fact that my hands in real life were kept together, whereas in the virtual reality of this ship I was in, they were kept apart. And it sort of confused my brain, and I realized how powerful functioning VR can be. And yet we've only just begun. This is like the first generation. This is the very early stages of movie making, like almost back in the 19th century. And so I think we have yet to even understand what we can do with this once it grows. And there are a range of experiences too. I mean, I think VR will not only be for game making. It's already being discussed using it for doctors, using it for military purposes, of course, and to provide alternate experiences that are outside of gaming. And also, even if there is a lot of talk now about making VR movies, I would say that they would still be very different from a normal movie, because you would still have a little bit of interaction in it, because you can, as a viewer, move around within this movie world. You can look around. And that sort of puts a whole different level of challenges to the movie makers to make sure that whatever you look at is interesting and drives your experience forward in that movie. With all that said, though, even though we've just scratched the surface, I think this will be what we call disruptive technology. This will turn things on their head within just a few years, I believe. These first sets, they're great, but I mean, imagine when the resolution has doubled and when the screens inside have become so big that when you look around with your eyes, you don't see the edges. I think by then we will have people that lose themselves completely in this world, and will be truly like virtual reality when it was described by science fiction authors in the late 80s and early 90s. And I think it's funny because Per talked about how we've always played games. I would say that we've told stories even longer. Storytelling has been with the human race, I think, from the very beginning. And for my sort of closing remarks about all this, what are the values of storytelling? I mean, of course, these are my takeaways from it. It encourages engagement in anything. If you add a story to most experiences, they become more involved. People start to care more. It also inspires emotions. It allows you to feel things that you might not feel in your regular life. You can experience fear or sadness or happiness for reasons that you yourself have never experienced, but that the characters you partake with are experiencing. And it also helps to widen our horizons. Stories can be about things that we've never experienced, and thus help us to understand what those experiences can be. And also allowing us to we don't have to have those experiences by ourselves, but we still learn about them, and they still help us grow and evolve. And finally, storytelling feeds our imagination. It inspires, and stories form other stories. I'm a storyteller because I love stories. I grew up on them. I consumed them voraciously. And in turn, it made me a storyteller. And I'm hoping that a lot of people that partake of stuff that I do also become storytellers, and so it spreads. And with that, I think Per might have a few questions, but I'm done for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I do have a few questions, and maybe you also have questions. So I think we have an extra mic, and we're certainly happy to take those questions. But Kristoffer, if I may go first, then the first Mirror's Edge came out in 2008.
2008, 2007. Yeah. Oops.
Was it? Oh, did you say?
I think it's 7, but
all
it might be 8.
Yeah, even
actually,
better.
Anyway,
I'm sure you're right. And anyway, and now it's 9 years later. The things that you talk about, the parkour gameplay felt fresh. The visuals are still unique. The female protagonist is still unusual. And we talk about how fast our industry changes, but in a way, it didn't change that much if the same game concept could be very novel and fresh 9 years after. So there's two questions in there. What took you so long? And the other would be, what do you think about the sort of evergreen flavor of Mirror's Edge?
I think the first Mirror's Edge was way ahead of its time. I think that's why it feels that it's still fresh. And At the time when the first game came out, a female protagonist like Fate that was not centered around sexuality and stuff like that didn't exist. And it did not exist within the sort of what we call the AAA game segment, with these games with big budgets intended for a large international audience. And so I think it was way ahead of its time. And the same thing with the parkour, the first-person parkour, and parkour in general. I mean, since then we've seen Assassin's Creed. It's a parkour game, right? But it's third-person. But we've also seen Dying Light, which is a first-person parkour game, and that was not made until many years after the first Mirror's Edge. So I think that's partly why it still feels fresh, because the first one was too early in a way. And as for why it still feels fresh, I think maybe it shouldn't be fresh to have a female protagonist. We should have many, many more of them out there, and I'm hoping to see many more of them within the coming years. It's going in the right direction, I think, but it's not moving fast enough. But it never is, right?
Yeah, some people say that Miss Pac-Man was the first ever female protagonist.
That's true, yes.
Like 1983 or something. All right, we have time. We have a few minutes if there's somebody who has a question. Yes, over here, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the speech. Mirror's Edge did launch in 2008, and I think it had, like, the impact, it had nothing to do with the fact that the protagonist was female. I think that's bullshit. The thing is, it was very kinetic, and I think it was the first game that gave this feeling of presence in the virtual world after Trespasser. And Trespasser was a very bad game, although also like forward-thinking. And Mirror's Edge was a good thing, and so I thought that it had lots of potential, but it was very limited because of this level system. So my first question is, did you consider going for really open world, maybe with some something like the guys are doing now with Hitman? I mean, this more or less free objectives, like you have this sandbox, and so you just maybe it would be able to make it open for the players to think of these objectives. And if you did consider this, why didn't you go in this direction? Was it because EA marketing wanted to have something like Deus Ex or Dishonored? I mean, it looks like you moved towards this immersive simulation thing, and I think that Mirror's Edge has nothing to do with the storytelling. It's all about motion and in certain way, solving puzzles in this open world. So that's my first question, and I'd like to ask the other one if you don't mind.
So just if I understand your question correctly, if we consider to make the game, you mean more of a sandboxy game where the player would be free to run around as they like and not be about storytelling?
Yes.
Was that your question?
And also to explore this unique feature connected to this kinetic nature of the game and of the character and all this moving around this sandbox.
I see what you mean. I honestly can't tell you everything that went into deciding the exact concept for the Mirror's Edge, because I came aboard once it had been greenlit and certain decisions had already been made. One of them was to have a narrative that would drive the game forward. As if for going more sandbox, I mean, we definitely explored different venues for how sandboxy can we be. But I think this relates a little bit to the scoping thing, that there was we discussed larger and smaller worlds to run in, but it all came down to how much can we build within a reasonable amount of time, and with the team we had and so on. And the game that we ended up making is a result of that scoping exercise. So it is sort of a result of, I think, a combined result of the ambition of what we wanted to do originally, but also the reality of what we could do in the end. So that's what we ended up with.
And maybe if I can tag on to that, so perhaps it's not necessarily only the sort of decision whether to be more story-driven or whether to be more open world, because even without story, you still have to do a lot of game design tweaks to make the game work. And one of the problems with the first Mirror's Edge was that it was nose-bleedingly hard. A lot of people didn't get past the first level even. So if you want to try to make an open sandbox game and at the same time have a difficulty level that works for the player, you will end up with an infinite amount of design decisions for all these parkour challenges. So maybe, I'm just guessing, but maybe that's...
No, you're actually, that's definitely a big part of it. And you're right, the first game was insanely hard, which, definitely some people really enjoyed. But, the hard truth of it is also that these games need to sell a lot of copies. And so the ideal game is challenging for both somebody who's really good at it and for somebody who is not very good at it, and both are having fun. And that's what we try to accomplish with Mirror's Edge Catalyst, in that players that were not necessarily great should be able to play the game and get through the game, whereas players that are really great at parkour running and that were great in the first game would still be given a challenge in that they could find their own paths that would be quicker and faster maybe than whatever the easier player chose. Trying to cater to both. But yeah, that's definitely a challenge.
And you had one more question?
Yes, thank you. In the first presentation, you showed all these games made in Sweden, and I think you missed one very important one. It's called Quiz Up. Yeah. Do you know it?
Is that Quiz Duel?
No. It's a trivia platform. It's a mobile app that's with many tons of different trivia. In Russian it's Viktorina, platforma для викторин. And I don't know if anyone has ever played it. I mean, I have lots of friends who played it. Yeah, and I think it's one of the best Swedish games that of the last. It is Swedish. Plain Vanilla is an Iceland studio. Okay, it doesn't matter. So the thing is, this is a very interesting game. It's first of all, it's casual. It's the only game that I play with my mother, and I think it's the only game that she has played after Myst. And the second thing is it's multiplayer. You play with other people with whom you have some common interests, and it can be very, very niche. I mean, I play in Monty Python trivia and Stanley Kubrick films and something else with people from other countries, and it really connects us. And the last thing is it's a platform, and this is the most interesting thing for me, because these guys from Plain Vanilla, they enabled anyone to add new topics, and this is why it's so big, and that's why everyone can find his own topic that really maybe it's geek or something like that. So my question is, do you think that something like that, this philosophy could be applied to AAA game design? I mean, Valve enabled people to create levels and mods, and it was a breakthrough. But it had a certain demand for your skills. You need to know how to make levels, even if it's an easy editor. But this game, you have to do nothing. You just go to the website, you create topic, you add questions, and that's it. Do you think that something like that could happen in AAA gaming?
So I think that's a great example of audience participation, and actually a really smart move by the developers to let the players make the content, because that less work for the developers. I would add one thing, and that is that parkour is like a different type of gameplay that a lot of people aren't familiar with, whereas trivia is one of the most fundamental forms of gameplay. Anyone understands trivia. So it's a theme, it's a game mechanic that makes it very accessible also to a larger audience. But to your point, I think we see that all the time. AAA games having the players themselves create content. You mentioned Valve. Counter-Strike came out of that culture. They just gave the players the tools to make mods for Half-Life, and then Counter-Strike became much more successful than the game itself. So I think we have a great tradition as an industry to share our development tools and to invite the players to co-create. So I think we see that happening. I would say that that's a basic part of the strategy and the core of what games are.
I mean, absolutely. I think the discussion about like player participation and player co-creation happens on every project. Some games are more suited to it than others, but I think it's definitely, in my experience at least, in almost every project now, there is an ambition to have at least some of it. It might be very, very light, or it can be very, very big. I mean, I said I was playing a lot of Skyrim, and I think I have like 25 mods active for Skyrim. Many of them are, huge things that have been created by very, very talented people. And also, I mean, the modding community, I feel, is very important because like the role-playing games and Commodore 64 of Sweden, modders, many of them go on to become video game makers because it gives them great experience and learning of how to make a game while doing mods. So with that said, I think there is also definitely games that are not having any of that, but it depends a lot, I think, on the project and what's right for that project.
All right, so I asked Gala if we have time for a few more questions. One more, okay, please.
Yes, thank you. Hello, my name is Mike. First of all, thank you for this lecture. I think that I can say from all of us that we're all very flattered, and it's always nice to see how professional share his experience. So I got 2 questions. Second one is really small. First, in the first Mirror's Edge, Fate was able to shoot from the gun. And in Mirror's Edge Catalyst, this feature was removed. And what we have is we ended up on small arenas, run around in circles in this like bullet time focus, which with you can't be hit by bullet, and you just have to collide your enemies with each other. So my question is why it was decided to remove this feature, and wouldn't it be like some move to open up a character like Fate a little bit more, like we see in the reboot of Tomb Raider with Lara Croft? We see her first kill with the gun.
So that's a very good question. And gunplay was discussed quite a bit early on in the project. It was felt, I think, one thing, gunplay got a lot of criticism in the first game because it wasn't really good. And so when we looked at making the combat for the second game, there was definitely a discussion like, shall we keep the gunplay? Or do we remove it and try to make it into a cleaner combat experience? I agree with you that the combat did not, we didn't end up where we wanted to be with the combat. And it didn't become as good as we hoped that it would be. But removing the guns made it into it felt more appropriate for the type of character that Fate became in the second game, to not use guns and to be more of a fighter, melee fighter. And so that was sort of a combination of thematic decision, but also partly a gameplay decision to make the combat system focused on actually just fighting, punching, and kicking, and so on.
Thanks. Well, at the end, Mirror's Edge Catalyst ended up beautiful game with gorgeous graphic and good gameplay. So the second question is, you say earlier that we got story-tell games like from Telltale, and we got sandbox like Minecraft, and I know that world is not black and white, but I want to know your thoughts about this quote. Do you agree or disagree with this? One man once said that the plot in video games is like the plot in adults' movie. It's useless. Did you agree or not with this?
If I agreed, I wouldn't have a job, would I?
Yeah, that's why I question.
I do not agree. I think that's it's a fun statement, definitely, and I think he's right for some games. But I personally, I play games for story. That's the reason I play games mainly. I've never even tried Candy Crush yet, because it has no allure for me. Whereas I love playing games with what I feel are strong stories, because they engage me in ways that a movie or a book necessarily wouldn't. And I love to explore rich worlds, sci-fi or fantasy or whatever, through RPGs that contain those worlds. So I do not agree with that statement as a blanket statement. But I agree with the fact that there are definitely maybe games that would do better without a story, that would be more clean and just be about the gameplay and the game mechanics, and not try to force a story in there. But even then, I mean, even in some of the most simplistic games, they've grown, some of them at least, maybe a little bit richer because they had like a small purpose to what you're doing. But again, that's me personally. I mean, I'm sure there are tons of people out there that enjoy a game for just being a game. I mean, chess does not have a story, right? It's just about you beating the other guy, and one is white, the other is black. It doesn't really mean anything. And still, it can be a great amount of fun to play. So I would say that games can be both. It can definitely have story and definitely do well without, depending on what type of game it is.
Thank you very much for answering my questions.
Yeah, and also games can make stories. If you play a really good game of chess, you want to brag about it and you want to tell the story of how you beat me.
Very true.
So hands down. One last question. So will you make Mirror's Edge Catalyst in VR?
I can't answer whether or not we will do it. I can tell you that I've tried out a very, very early prototype-ish version of it, and it was kind of cool. But if it ever actually makes it into VR, I can't tell at this point.
We'd love to play it. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. It's been a pleasure. It's been an honor. It's been an inspiration to share this couple of hours with you, and enjoy your Friday. Thank you so much.
It's been great. Thank you all.